Hello, everybody. Sorry, I was a bit flustered there. I had to just run back to my flat to get my clicker, because every time I speak at a conference, I forget the clicker. Thank you all for coming. I don't have as many people in the room as Woody's wheel had earlier, but I already did the selfie when I was doing this pitch, so when I send it to my wife, it'll look like I had a full room, so that's really good. So, crack on. Who am I? I'm James. Nice to meet you all. I've been working for ThoughtWorks for the last 3 years, which is, I have to say, fantastic. If anybody wants to job at ThoughtWorks, come and see me afterwards. We're always hiring people. What I tend to do at ThoughtWorks is agile transformation type work. I used to be a software developer. Now I kind of help other people to write the software, which is a really rewarding thing. If you've not heard of ThoughtWorks, this is a marketing slide, which we're supposed to put in all our presentations. Don't spend too much time on that. Oh yeah, and here's various books that people have written from ThoughtWorks. You'll notice on the right-hand side there's a book about microservices. I think Sam Newman wrote that one. That's what I'm here to talk about. But before I crack on, a little story about this week. Ages ago, I booked this train to come to here, and back in April, May's time, and of course, I had no concept of what might be happening on Wednesday, and the problem is, if you look at this is my booking, is that it was due to get into Penryn at 7:15, and there was a football match going on at 7. So it was a disaster. I absolutely couldn't stand that, but then, fortunately, in the week, I got this email from thetrainline.com. The crucial parts are this bit here that says there's been service alterations, and therefore my train may not exist, but also this piece here that says I can get a full refund, which was fantastic. So I managed to change the train to an earlier train, got here at about 6 o'clock. Wasn't particularly, well, I've got a smiley face there. Don't quite understand why, but there's me and my daughters before the game that we did win at the weekend. This is this room. About 5 minutes after the game ended, I think I was in tears at the time, but you can't probably see it on this photo. Then yesterday, it was a lovely, lovely day yesterday. I'm sure you all had a good time. That's my colleague Julian talking about agile methods being dangerous. And I quite like this photo because it kind of looks like he's a cardboard cutout. He actually is a real person. He spoke very well yesterday. Then this morning, I saw, I must say I was privileged to see Woody's talk, which was absolutely amazing. And Woody pointed out that you always need to put a cat in your talks, which I always used to do, but then I thought I wasn't going to do it this time, but because the last time I spoke at a conference was in Poland, and it was about quantum computing, of which I know absolutely nothing. And I put this joke in about my cat. This is my daughter's cat, so it's not Schrodinger's cat, it's Clementine's cat. And what she's doing there is she's showing the standard cat mood. If my clicker would work, you'd see it, and that's the standard mood that cats show. So I thought if I ran it through a quantum computer, could I get the cat to do quantum superposition of its moods? And I thought, well, let's see what happens. So I ran my cat, my daughter's cat, Clementine's cat, through this quantum program, and it turns out that cats do have different moods. So it turned out she could have 8 moods simultaneously. So, now on to what I actually got invited here to talk about, which may or may not be the interesting part. I'm going to talk about microservices, and I've noticed my colleague James Lewis standing over there, which is making me rather nervous because he knows everything about microservices. In fact, he may even have invented the word, I don't know. He disputed this with me the other day, but I don't know. So what am I going to talk about? Why do we have microservices? What happens to complexity in your system? Looking a bit about outcomes, what the trade-offs are, and I've got some case studies. So I actually have done this stuff. I've been involved in teams that have done this stuff. So, to kick off, why would we bother with microservices? What do microservices promise? Why might we use them? So, here's some of the benefits. You should reduce, I think one of the key benefits is reducing handovers between teams. The idea is that everybody knows all their own stuff, everybody just works on their stuff, they don't have to pass things backwards and forwards. Independent scalability of components is something that you can get. Not on any of the projects I've worked on, but it's there, it's available. independent code bases and releases, I think that's a massive, massive benefit. When you don't have to do lockstep releases with other teams, that's a huge payoff. You should get simpler components. I'll talk a bit about complexity. And then there's these other things. Technology diversity, I think that can be both a good and a bad thing in my experience, but some people say it's good. Apparently you can use the right technology for the right job. You should reduce, or you should be able to deal with failures in a slightly better way. If one component in your system fails, maybe the bit that deals with shipments fails, well, that shouldn't stop other people from buying stuff on your website. So that's obviously a key benefit. So I want to talk very briefly about complexity because I went to a talk some time ago, last year I think it was, in Berlin, and there was a person arguing about what happens to complexity and how it can multiply in systems. And his argument was that if you organize things better, you can reduce complexity. And let's examine this. If you've got 5 things in your system, and they're not constrained to not do anything, then between those 5 systems, you can have how many different possible connections? 10 possible connections. So if I then add another thing, I'm adding 6. I was going to say 6, but according to my slide, 5 more possible connections. I ought to read the words. And you can see that as the thing scales up, there's more and more possible connections, there's more and more complexity involved in there. So I didn't draw this one, but if you have 16 things, whatever those things are, you'd have 120 possible connections. So it's the complexity of that thing is order of n squared, I think. Yeah, n minus 1 over 2. So as you can see, it's really complex. So what if I have a microservices thing? So here's those 16 things that I mentioned. What if I, instead of just having them unconstrained talk to one another, what if I group them into, let's call these contexts, and then I constrain those things so that you can only talk between things in the same context or directly between contexts. So now instead of having 120 possible communication lines, in this example I've given here, I've reduced it to 31 things. So is that a simpler system? Well, I'm not so sure, because when I reasoned this out, I saw this argument, as I say, in a conference. I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, well, actually, if you have these 16 things, are they really going to talk to every other thing? Probably not. And more than that, even in my other picture there, when I said you could only talk between the contexts, there's no guarantee that there isn't more than one connection between contexts. And more than that, what I've certainly discovered in recent years is that what you've actually done with your complexity is you've not reduced it, you've shifted it around. And one thing I've noticed in particular is the complexity has moved into a way that can be hard to reason with. And when I've worked with microservices on projects, one thing that's striking to me is that if you have a traditional monolithic program, it can be very easy to debug stuff. It's very easy to see what's going on. You see this line of code, then this line of code, then this line of code. On the other hand, if you have a microservice communication thing going on, the logic is then distributed amongst the components. It's distributed amongst whatever communication protocol you're using. It can get hard to reason with. And for me personally, maybe I'm just a rubbish software developer, I don't know, but I find it difficult to reason with that type of distributed logic. Maybe other people are better than I am at it. So I always do this when I do this presentation. I basically said everything that's on this slide. Let's move on. Is there anything I need to say there? Yeah, so another point is you multiply the complexity in other ways. You've got more builds now. You've got more technologies in play. The last project I worked on, we had about 20 different software development languages in play at one time, and I couldn't get my head around it, for sure. As I say, maybe people that are better than me at writing software can. So, what I think we ought to be doing, instead of starting with microservices as a requirement, we ought to be saying to ourselves, all right, what outcomes matter to me? So what often can happen in software development in business is a business person will come to us at ThoughtWorks and say, okay, we want to do microservices. And I'll say, well, when was that ever a business requirement? And that's an implementation detail. And then I would hope that most of us would turn around to such a person and say, okay, what's the problem to which you think that's a good solution? What is the problem to which that's the proposed solution? So what I like to get people to think about is what outcomes are important to you. So let's talk about some outcomes. So one thing I've really noticed in software in general is in creating software, in fact in business in general, handovers hurt. I've got this nice little picture that I created with a ThoughtWorks colleague. If you look at the picture there, that's supposed to be a boat. And she on the left has a piece of paper. She needs to hand it over to the other woman. And they're in the same boat, literally. That's going to be an easy handover. And this kind of models what's going on when people are in the same team. Now, if we look at this picture. In this picture, she's in a different boat from her, but they have sympathy with one another. They're both in a boat. They kind of get what's going on. So that, to me, looks a bit like if you have two teams that are actually pulling in the same direction. Maybe it's a software team and a database team. Maybe something like that. The handover is, it's going to take a bit more time because there's going to be a context switch. There's things being handed over. But it's not that painful. And you can see that in handing the piece of paper over, it might get splashed. It might lose fidelity. And then the third thing is this, what we call a transactional handover. And in this case, she needs to give the piece of paper to this woman. That's meant to be a submarine. I don't know if it's obvious. We're constrained to use only 9 shapes in our drawings when we do artwork for ThoughtWorks, and we have to be creative with it. So in that picture, she needs to not only understand where the submarine is, she needs to arrange for it to surface, she needs to arrange a time for it to surface, she needs to be in the right place in the ocean. So you can see that's hard. And what I've discovered, particularly since I've worked for ThoughtWorks, and particularly when I've worked in banks, almost everything internally is this transactional type of handover. And it's so costly. It just wastes time, it wastes effort, it's just really costly. So if you can reduce handovers or try and push all your handovers into that top left part of the picture, you're going to do really well. So that's a really good outcome to strive for. Here's another outcome that we might be interested in. I still don't quite know why I've got that picture of the sheep, but hey. Each team ought to be able to release its own code. It's a nice, simple thing to be striving for, but it's incredible how many places you come across where that isn't the case. In the company that I just started working for a couple of weeks ago, they have to do releases, well, they think they have to do releases. They've constrained themselves to do releases every 4 weeks because everybody has to release the stuff. All the teams are working in the same code base. It's a really, really bad situation. If there's a defect, it takes days and days and days to actually get the fix out there because they have to wait for this other team to be ready. So if you can reduce that coordination overhead between your teams, if you can prevent teams from blocking other teams, that's a great outcome. So that's something that you should be working towards as well. Independent scalability of components. Is this something that we might be interested in? I think there are cases where you are. You can get this from microservices. There are other ways of getting it. I have worked in a couple of places where this is a thing. In my old job, we had a sort of transactional part of the website, and we had a part of the website that was more sort of admin-type focused. And the loads were different on those sites. So obviously, it was a big benefit for us to be able to scale them separately. Well, it would have been if we ever did it, but turned out we didn't. So that's a good outcome. Is that a typo? No, it's not. Strong module boundaries. Here's another thing. You can have this outcome without doing microservices, which is what I'm going to talk about shortly, but strong module boundaries are good. If you have a system in which the responsibilities and the roles and responsibilities of all the components are obviously laid out, that's a good thing. If you have a component that's called sales or something and it just deals with sales, yeah, that's great. Do you need microservices to get that outcome? Possibly, possibly not. You know, it'll help, but you don't have to have mic comms. I don't know what I just said there. I do apologize. What are the downsides of microservices? I think I may have ripped this off from one of Martin Fowler's slides. Let's see what happens next. Oh, yeah. There you go. There's Martin Fowler's, a link to Martin Fowler's. Martin Fowler wrote a blog post some time ago about the microservices premium. Basically, you need to understand what the costs are. If someone says to you in your company or a company you're working for, we want to do microservices, here's the downsides. You need to understand that you've got to have a decent pipeline there. You've got to have DevOps type work. You need to be monitoring your system really well. If you're not doing that already, when I would urge, I hope everybody in this room does that sort of stuff, you're going to start needing to. You need to have a good understanding of how to deal with failure. This is new logic that you're going to build into your system. You need to consider things such as circuit breaker patterns. You probably should read Release It by Michael Nygaard. That's a great book. You need to deal with eventual consistency. I don't know if anybody in this room has dealt with that, but this is the problem where data exists in one place, you need to pass it somewhere else. What do you do with that? What's your strategy? And complexity, I think I already mentioned this. Me, personally, again, I'll say it again, maybe I'm a rubbish software developer, but I found all the different technologies really, really hard to get my head around on the last project I worked on. It's a good job they made me a tech lead, which meant I didn't have to write any code anymore. But there you go. And then you have to deal with communication. I've just realized, look at that. That bullet point's a different size from that one there. That's rubbish. God's sake. What am I doing? Oh, yeah, and certificates. Oh, my God. We worked in a microservices environment in a bank a couple of years ago, and we had to get all the certificates on all the different services so they could communicate with one another. It took us 5 months to get a certificate. But that was a bank. And actually, certificates can be quite costly. You may find this sort of thing happening. If you don't do it well, you're going to find that sometimes you end up doing lockstep releases of your own microservices. If you've not segregated the things in an effective manner, you might find that you play a story and it touches 3 microservices. Now, maybe there's an argument there that you wrote that story badly, but if you're finding it hard to return value to the end user without writing stuff across lots of services, then you're going to end up having to do some kind of coordination of releases. I think there's an important point there is funding. You need to understand that your product is something that needs to be funded on an ongoing level. If you work in an organization that says, here you go, here's £500,000 to do this thing, and then they say, well, there's no more money now, like walk away, it's going to look after itself, well, it's not. So you need to understand that. You need to be talking to your organization and talking about the funding model and talk about funding products on an ongoing basis, not funding projects. Whew. So I did debate this slide, but I put it in the last time I did this. Things don't always go well. Now, one of the jobs I worked on with ThoughtWorks was a microservices project, as I say, and when we got there, the company we were working for had, we'd worked there some time before we'd started a project, then they'd had a change in budget, so we were uninvited, shall we say. And then several years later, they came back to ThoughtWorks and said, okay, we actually need you. We need you to fix what this has become. And what we found was that it was in a bit of a mess. And I think the main reason why it was in a bit of a mess was because it didn't have a consistent vision, because for the previous few years, it had various different people working on it, various different overall ideas. You could see the sort of DNA of the various tech leads that had worked on it. I meant to take that third bullet point out because James told me it was rubbish, so I won't mention that one. It wasn't being maintained well, and we found it was hard to do stuff. We had a situation where they really didn't have DevOps type working in place. We had to come in and do that. I'm told before I got there that the first thing that one of our people did was to look at all their systems and say, well, if you don't move this into the cloud, then we can't work with it. We need to move it out of that data center and into the cloud. I was involved in putting lots of monitors everywhere that actually looked at the system, because up until then, they just hadn't done it. And as I think I already mentioned, waterfall funding, my big bugbear. They felt that if you just paid £1 million for something, it was done. I think we probably know that that isn't the case. There were inconsistencies in implementations and, strange technology choices. I was told that this company made a decision sometime 3-4 years ago that all the new microservices they built were going to be written in Clojure. And the reason why they did that was because they wanted to retain their developers. They felt that if they carried on, this always happens to me, I pontificate for too long and my computer does that. They felt that if they did something cool, wrote it in Clojure, they'd retain their developers. So what then happened was they were one of the few companies in that part of the world that did Clojure. All the developers upskilled, started writing in Clojure, went off and got higher paid jobs elsewhere. And then they couldn't hire Clojure devs because they were too expensive. I kid you not. So I can't end this story without saying this is what ThoughtWorks were doing. We found we had to instill the DevOps culture. We fought really hard to get them to assign us money for the product. And I think we won that battle just after I left. And we sort of did a job of redesigning the microservices, looking at them and saying, we need to align these with your business units, right? They're just making sure that people understand what they do. So that was, in some ways, a good situation. But, there's still a lot of work to do there. A lot of my friends still work on that company, but it's getting better. So I would like to talk about when I have worked on stuff where we started with an outcome and we facilitated that outcome. So some of the outcomes I talked about earlier that are associated with microservices, this is really the point I'm making. You don't need necessarily to go to a full microservices implementation to get some of the outcomes. So here's some real stuff I worked on. It's a while since I've seen these slides. Right. We had a situation. I worked in a startup company for 9 years before I came to ThoughtWorks. Like all startups, the thing grew into this massive monolith, and we were in a situation where I was running a team that we were mainly responsible for the back-end type tools, the tool sets that were there for other people to sell stuff on our website. And the reason why I was involved in that team was right at the start of the organization when we were dividing responsibilities. There was one other dev. My employee number was 1 in that company. It was great. It was like Mr. Burns with his national insurance number. It said 00001. And anyway, myself and this other guy, we were dividing up the responsibilities, and the CTO said to us, right, so one of you needs to take charge of the website, and one of you needs to take charge of the tools. And my feeling was, if I take charge of the website, I'm going to get phoned in the middle of the night all the time when it goes down. So I said, I'll do the tools. So that was the situation. And then eventually it all ended up being, originally we wrote Windows stuff for maintenance, but then when the web moved on and it became more functional, we were writing tools just into our website. I could not release my tools without releasing the whole website. And that situation persisted for a number of years until we sat down and we said, look, we need to fix this. It's ridiculous that I can't release a tool that helps a seller without releasing the whole e-commerce site with all the risk that goes with that. So we needed to decouple somehow. We wanted to make it so that we could do that. That was the only outcome we cared about. So microservices would facilitate that outcome. But we were in a place where we were. So we needed to move to it. So this was kind of the solution that we had. And this is obviously a very simplified picture, but here were the tech teams we had at the time. Again, I can't really remember exactly what it was, but there's about 4 tech teams in my recollection, and I was leading the tools team. And we had some business teams. So you may say, okay, what's wrong with this picture? It looks relatively simple. It looks relatively easy until you start saying, okay, well, who cares about the different parts of this system? So the web team cared about those bits that I've highlighted in blue. Most of the web app and maybe half the database. My team, the tools team, we cared about those red things. We cared about the internal apps. We cared about the SOAP services that were in between them and the database. We cared about stuff in the database. What about the infrastructure team? Well, they kind of cared about everything. They were in charge of the computers that things run on. Then you've got the database team. So they cared about the database, but they kind of also cared about the stuff that talked to the database, right? Because they didn't want us running queries that would cripple the database. which, being devs, we're very good at doing that stuff. And then, if that's not confusing enough, the business teams, the sales team probably care about that stuff, right? They care about the website, they care about bits of the database. Our partners team might care about those things. And then the other teams will care about other bits. And the interesting thing about this picture as well, when you look at it, is none of the business teams even knew that those SOAP services existed. So good luck trying to, say, fix some tech debt in there. Good luck going to those business teams and saying, I want some budget to fix this shit because it doesn't work. Well, you ain't going to get it because nobody cares about it. Look, only us in the tech teams cared about it. So that picture that's what we were dealing with. So if you want to add any value into the business, because of all those overlapping lines, you can see you're going to have to, well, it's hard. So what did we do? We moved to a better place. We refactored everything into assemblies. This was all .NET code at the time. We started using shared assemblies, sort of pulling out the dependencies. We started, NuGet was a relatively new thing at the time. It was a dependency manager. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. That really helped us. And then we effectively hived the code base into smaller pieces so that we could develop it. And we call that splitting it vertically. And we made our teams, we actually sat the business people with the software teams. So I started having a BA working in my team, which was fantastic. I'd never had that before. And, you know, we got towards a better place. So if we look at my confusing picture, that's what it looked like before. And I have to say, so if I go back to that stuff on the previous slides, all of this took us, to my recollection, about a year. So it was not something simple. But we managed to get to a better place. We basically rearranged the business from looking like that to looking something like this. What you notice about this picture is we didn't split the database up. This was an argument that I had at the time. I didn't win the argument, and I kind of, since then, I'm not sure whether it was right or wrong not to split the database up, but I think it was just too much effort. So we never did it. So we still had a sort of database team that was in a bit of a silo. But this is what we achieved. We separated our code base. That was the big win. That was all we cared about, right? Nobody cared about saying, in fact, I'd never even heard the term microservices at this point in my life. I didn't hear it until after I interviewed with ThoughtWorks. I actually described that story during my interview, and I think that's why they gave me the job. I didn't realize I was describing a kind of microservices thing. And we achieved, as I say, a closer alignment between the business people and the software teams. So we had a really good understanding of what value meant and how to return it to the business. It was fantastic. It was really good. We didn't get separate scalability of the components because we were still deploying it to the same servers. However, it would have been fairly simple for us to achieve that had we wanted to later. And we didn't get bounded data contexts. So we still had a monolithic database. We still had tables that had like 200 columns, but each bit of software would only reference 5 of them or something, you know, so clearly that wasn't optimal. But we avoided having to manage the data, the eventual consistency, and we didn't introduce all that extra complexity that I mentioned earlier. We didn't have messaging systems going between the different parts of the system. We didn't have code that was hard to reason with, or at least to my recollection, we didn't. You know, so overall, I think that was a win. We got those outcomes. Here's another outcome. Many companies that we work in at ThoughtWorks are very heavily siloed, technology-based silos. It's something that grows up over time. It's something that we try to address. I went in with a small team to a company that was taking about 13 months, they told us, from the point of somebody having an idea to the point of some software going live was taking them 13 months. So they kind of knew that was bad, but we needed to show them that there was a better way. So that was the outcome we cared about. We wanted to reduce your cycle time. So after a little bit of digging around in the company, we kind of realized that the whole reason why it was taking ages was all these technology silos. They had all this legacy software, and all the people that work in the legacy software had a really deep understanding of what their software did to these documents. They had no idea why. When we started talking to the people, what we realized was the correct question for us to be asking them was, what outcome are you facilitating by doing this to this document? Because their whole system was basically a thing that people could read documents out of. And none of these people knew. It was like, well, my system adds these tags. Yeah, but what do those tags do? They're like, I don't know. So I'm going to whiz through this slide. Top left there, that's my colleague Karen. She's fantastic. I asked her to do something that we thought was relatively simple. This was in a showcase with our client. So she spoke to all these people trying to work out this outcome, which was a pretty simple thing to do. And they told her about a system that she needed to understand, which introduced her to another person that was probably in the US or something, because they had a load of people in the US. So then that person talks to her, she sends a few emails, she gets introduced to another person. Hey, blimey, this person's in Singapore, didn't even know they had an office in Singapore. Then this person says, oh, you need to know about this system. That system controls that system. We're like, wow, didn't even know that system existed. Never heard of it. Then what happened? Some more people came in, some more messages, et cetera, wow, 4 more messages. At the time I remember presenting this, I actually had real names for all these people, but I've long since forgotten. But I think you get the picture. Eventually, they put us in touch with the right team that could tell us some stuff. They put us onto some documentation. It was a really simple outcome. It took us about 3 weeks, to my recollection, to get this really simple outcome. And it was all because of all these silos. So what we're saying was, okay, here's an outcome that we really need. We understand your problem now. This is why you can't return value. We need to break these silos. So what did they have? Endless silos they had. That's a great title. Look at that. This was essentially their business. They get documents from somewhere. These were legal documents, generally speaking. It could be a court report. It could be something like that. It gets ingested into their system, goes through, as I say there, about 15 siloed processes, and then they call this an enhanced document. It's basically, it turns it into some XML. It's got some tags that the front-end app understands. That then goes in a document database, and they call that content production. On the other side, they had something called shared display services. And by the way, I'm massively simplifying this layout here. And they had a US app. Here was the really crazy part. This US app had been live for 5 years. We were working on the UK app. They asked us to use the same framework, as they called it, as the US app. So we had the UK app. The UK app was largely built by this time, but we were adding new functionality to it. The UK app wasn't live yet. But in order for us to deploy that UK app into a pre-production environment, it was so tightly coupled through these shared display services and some shared libraries, so tightly coupled, we had to deploy the US app into the live environment in order to deploy the UK app into the pre-prod environment. That was the situation we were faced with. So, wow. I don't know what I did when I found that out. I probably felt like killing myself. An interesting thing about this as well was they had this wonderful idea. All that stuff in yellow on the left was like a team based in Woking in the UK. All the stuff on the right was a team based somewhere else, were sort of distributed across the UK and the US. They didn't talk to one another. They told us, yeah, on this date in September of last year, all the content will be done and the app will be done and it's going to go live. And we're like, whoa. But no one is actually looking at the whole thing together. And they were like, well, no. And we said, well, what you need to do is understand that there's a single customer outcome there. Get one team owning that outcome. And that came back to us going to all these teams and saying, why does your system do what it does? So we got them thinking in terms of products. And what we did was, I like that title. I don't remember this slide. We got them thinking about the customer outcome. We said, look, what you need to think about is not what your system does, but why it does it. We don't think it's a good idea that you have architects that are responsible for a single system. We think those architects should be responsible for outcomes. Let's get them outcome-based. Let's get them outcome-led. And it worked. So what we managed to do was essentially get that cycle time down. We had it, as I say, it was 13 months. And this was remarkably quickly, as I remember it. We managed in 3 months to demonstrate that we could return, we got the cycle time down to like a day. And how did we do that? Well, we didn't have to go to full microservices, you might have guessed. I'm going to simplify this picture. Well, I'm not going to simplify this picture. I'm going to make it more complex, actually. I sort of moved the boxes around. So that was the situation we were given with. What we did was we ignored all this legacy. We said to them, there's no point in that legacy. Yes, it does stuff, but actually what's important is the outcomes it facilitates. So all this money that you're spending on maintaining that legacy, we're not sure if that's a good idea. So we understood what it was doing and why it was doing it, and we effectively rebuilt that code. So we had an architecture diagram that we'd done at the start of the engagement, and we basically just missed out a load of boxes on it and said, well, this is all, what's the point? Let's just go straight here. So we wrote that stuff ourselves. And I've called it, what have I called it? Product-focused enhancement. Great phrase. I must have been, God knows what, when I wrote that slide. And on the other side here, you might see the word microservice there, because this was the company that came to us and said, yeah, microservices are great. So we pretended it was a microservice. It wasn't actually a microservice. What it was an app that the main app proxied onto. So when you went to the certain URLs that were the functionality that it rewritten, it proxied onto another app. And I think I've got a dotted line illustrating that. Why is my, yeah, there you go. So the main UK app proxied onto our thing in the background. So it wasn't a full microservice. It didn't have a separate data store. It was still accessing data in the same document database. I don't think, to my recollection, that we went through those shared display services. We re-architected that functionality as well. But it was so simple what it was doing, we just couldn't get our heads around why they had the system as it was. And we did all this. As I say, it took us about 3 months to get to this situation. And they'd been taking 13 months to return the simplest bit of value. And from that point forward, we then started implementing stuff and iterating on the stories, and we was putting stuff live every couple of hours, basically. So that was the big win. At that point, I got bored with the project and moved somewhere else, because I felt like having solved the meta problem, it wasn't that interesting anymore. Oh, look, there's an arrow on the top there. So we reduced the cycle time today. So what was the outcome there? Shorter cycle time, fantastic outcome. Separate scalability, we actually deployed our stuff onto a separate server. We got them thinking about customer focus. I can't stress this message enough. That was the biggest lesson I learned from that, was telling our customers, telling our clients, look, understand what the customer wants. It's such a powerful message. Don't do anything unless it returns value to the customer. It's a slightly separate, I could have a whole talk on that, but there you go. However, we then had to manage our own deployments, we had to manage our own boxes, so our team, by definition, had to become more skillful, had to be responsible more for what it was doing, but I was happy to do that. And we did re-engineer a lot of stuff. That was unpopular with the client. They were saying to us, well, you've repeated work. And we were like, well, yes, but we've put it in a way that's much more maintainable. Yes, it's there. So that debate, yeah, they weren't necessarily happy with that, but there you go. And as I say, we put a load more support. It's mainly a smiley, but there's a little bit of a glum face there as well. But overall, I was pretty pleased with what we did there. So, I think at the end, here's my top tips. As I say, everything I've spoken about is start with your outcome and then go to the implementation. Never believe anybody that says microservice is a requirement. It's not. Okay? It can be good. It can be great. But here's some top tips. I don't understand why people wouldn't start with a monolith. I know that's a controversial view, and I've had arguments with people in ThoughtWorks, but I don't quite understand why you would start from the very outset of your project and say, let's do microservices. If you design your monolith well, it will be easy enough to split up. The first case study I gave you, we split a monolith, and one of the big lessons of that for me was, because we designed the code relatively well, I said it took a year or so. Actually, I think that was pretty quick. So yeah, start with monolith. We mentioned the microservices premium earlier, Martin Fowler's talk. You need to understand it's going to cost you money. Just, don't pretend it's not. You need to have this conversation up front, otherwise you could get yourself in a terrible pickle. I've called out eventual consistency again there. That was a real problem on my last project. We were constantly having discussions about what's the source of truth for this data? Why is it there? Why is it there? What do we do with it? Oh, God. I felt like this all the time. Yeah, I guess this lesson I learned by not having, as I mentioned, on this project where ThoughtWorks were brought in, then we weren't, and then we came back again. If you don't have this ongoing tech vision, you need a really strong technical leader that's going to keep that vision going. Because more than any other type of ecosystem, I think, that I've seen, if you get those various influences in it, it can end up in a dark, dark place. Yeah, following conventions is very important. I never used to pay too much attention to what the conventions are on things, but I now realize that because you're working on stuff that other people need to use, stick to those conventions. They're there for a reason. Yeah, I think I've said enough about this. I had to get a running photo in. What I love about that picture there is that Sebastian Coe, that's when he won the 1,500 meters in the Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984. When you look at, he's winning, you look at Steve Cram, who's finishing second, and his head's gone. He's like, oh, because he started, when Sebastian Coe went ahead of him and they just glided away like that, his head's completely still. So Steve Cram was all over the place. I don't know why I'm talking about that, but there you go. But just, understand what you want. Start with the outcomes. This is the biggest thing I can say. And then finally, yay, microservices are great. This picture here, that's one of Martin Fowler's pictures. And I love the metaphor. He says, you have to be this tall to use microservices. Look at the blog post. I think it's the one that I referenced earlier. But yeah, product thinking and customer focus will go a long way. Sounds a bit empty, that statement, and I never really understood what it meant until I'd been involved in putting it in place. Getting that focus on the product, understanding your customers, that's so important. If you have stuff there that doesn't map to a customer concept, I think that's tough. Increasingly, I've seen software and I go in there and I say, what outcome does this facilitate for the customer? And if you can't articulate that, I'd even question what the hell it's doing. If microservices are the right thing to do, go ahead and do it. But if it's not, think about those outcomes you want to facilitate. Think that there are other ways of doing it without using microservices. But yeah, I still think microservices are great. And I'm not allowed to say anything else because I work for ThoughtWorks. Those are some books that I've read recently. I recommend them. And that's all I have. So thank you very much for listening.